In a forgotten corner of a quiet European village, nestled between ancient cobbled streets and ivy-draped rooftops, there stood a peculiar little shop that most people walked past without truly noticing, a place where time itself seemed to slow, its presence marked by the soft ticking that escaped from behind frosted glass windows etched with swirling golden script that read, Horatius Thorne, Master Clockmaker. And though the name had faded over time, the air around the shop still carried the faint scent of brass, cedar oil, and something else, something older, almost like memory. Inside, where the sunlight filtered through dust-moated air and glinted off countless gears and polished hands, lived an elderly man with kind, thoughtful eyes, a gentle voice, and a secret he had kept for longer than anyone could guess. For Horatius. Thorne was no ordinary clockmaker. He was the last of a long line of timekeepers, caretakers of clocks not just for telling time, but for guarding it, mending it, and on rare occasions, bending it. And every clock he built, from the simplest carriage timepiece to the towering grandfather clocks that reached toward the ceiling, like wooden sentinels, held within them a sliver of something magical, a fragment of a mystery that went deeper than gears and pendulums. His most prized creation, however, stood in the very back of the shop, behind a velvet curtain in a room few had entered, a magnificent brass and ebony masterpiece adorned with astrological carvings, phases of the moon, and a central dial that shimmered like starlight even in shadow, known only as the Aeon clock, a device so precise, so deeply attuned to the flow of time that it could measure not just hours and minutes, but memories, dreams, forgotten moments, and the delicate strands that tied past and future together. And it was this clock that held Horatius's secret, for within its heart ticked not just craftsmanship, but a key to a door long hidden, one that led not through walls but through time itself. Horatius had discovered this quite by accident as a young apprentice, when, one snowy winter evening, while polishing the Aeon's golden casing, he brushed against the central dial just as the moonlight struck it, and with a soft chime like distant bells, the room around him had folded inward, and he had found himself standing in the very same workshop, but 80 years in the past, watching a younger version of his master tinker with gears too fine for the human eye to see, and from that moment on, his life had changed. For the Aeon was not merely a clock, it was a door, a library, and a guardian, and through it he had traveled across centuries, never to alter events, but to witness them, record them, and sometimes nudge lost things gently back to where they belonged. He had seen great fires and quiet births, watched empires rise and artists paint in silence, seen his own parents as children chasing birds through autumn fields. And though he had longed at times to intervene, to save, to stop, he had learned, the deepest lesson of all, that time was not his to command, only to tend like a garden, pruning gently, watering patiently, and letting each season pass as it must. But the years had grown heavy, and now, as his hands trembled slightly when turning the winding key, Horatius knew his own hourglass was nearly empty. And so, on a still evening painted with fading lavender light, he left a note in his careful script tucked inside the Aeon's side panel, where only someone truly curious might find it, and the note read, "To the one who hears the ticking, even when all else is quiet, welcome. This clock holds more than time. It holds stories, the kind that never end, only change shape. Wind it carefully and listen, for it will take you where you are meant to go." And then he locked the shop door for the final time, set the small brass chime to ring in 7 days, and walked slowly up the spiral staircase to his room beneath the rafters, where he lay upon his bed surrounded by unfinished blueprints, half-built clocks, and sketches of cities no longer standing, his breath slowing to the rhythm of ticking around him until he drifted gently into a sleep that felt not like an end, but like a continuation, as if he were stepping into the very machinery he had spent a lifetime understanding. Days passed and the shop remained closed, dust gathering softly on the windows, But the chime rang, right on time, and that was the day a girl named Elia, no older than 13 and fond of stories and forgotten places, passed by the shop with her father and stopped, drawn by a sound only she seemed to hear. A faint, melodic ticking like a lullaby inside a seashell. And when she pressed her face to the glass, she saw not dust and silence, but a soft light glimmering from behind a velvet curtain, and as if by invitation, the door creaked open, just enough for her to slip inside. She walked slowly among the shelves of clocks and timepieces, their hands all pointing slightly differently, yet all ticking in harmony, and as she reached the Aeon clock, the ticking seemed to pause, then resume in a new rhythm, one that matched her heartbeat, and she found the note exactly where it had been left. And as she read it, the clock chimed once, warmly, and her eyes widened, not in fear, but in wonder, because she understood, even if she didn't know how, that she had been called not to break the rules of time, but to care for them, to become the next keeper of its quiet music. And when she turned the central dial, the shop blurred around her, and she saw not one world, but many, unfolding like pages of a vast and ancient book, each tick a word, each talk a pause, and as she stepped through the threshold of the Aeon clock, the shop remained behind, quiet once more, but alive in its stillness, waiting, as all good stories do, for the next curious soul to listen for the ticking and begin again. The Aeon clock had closed its eyes again, its ticking now slow and soft, like breathing in sleep. But Elia, bright-eyed and wrapped in a coat 2 sizes too big, was already far from the little village, though her feet had not moved an inch, for the clock had taken her not just to another time, but to another version of the world, one folded gently beneath layers of history, memory, and possibility. And as the light around her settled, she found herself standing in the middle of a vast, domed chamber lit by thousands of glowing orbs suspended in the air like stars trapped in amber, and each orb hummed with faint sound, the distant clatter of hooves, the rustle of parchment, the hush of falling snow. And Elia understood without knowing how that these were fragments of time, memories held still like butterflies in glass, and she was not alone in this place, for walking slowly along a curved brass walkway that spiraled. Toward the ceiling was a woman in robes the color of faded moonlight, her face ageless and calm, and when she noticed Elia, she smiled gently and said, "So, the Aeon has chosen again." And her voice rang like water from a spring, soft and clear, and she led Elia through the chamber, past doorways that shimmered with strange light and clocks that ran backward, sideways, and in spirals, explaining that this was the liminal archive, a sanctuary between moments, built by those who tended the balance of time not with control, but with care, and that Horatius Thorn had once stood where Elia now stood. Many years ago, wide-eyed and unsure, yet destined to become a guardian. And though he was gone now, his presence lingered in the gears and halls like a song half-remembered, and Elia, though overwhelmed, felt something stir in her chest, a sense of belonging that felt like remembering something she'd never been told, and the woman, who called herself Mira, gave her a brass pendant shaped like an hourglass and told her that this was her key, not to power, but to understanding. And then she asked a curious question. "What memory do you carry that does not belong to you?" And Elia blinked, puzzled, before realizing that ever since she had stepped through the Aeon, she had begun to feel dreams that were not her own. Images of a boy building a sundial with stones, of a woman counting stars with a bone-carved abacus, of a child alone in a clock tower watching years pass through stained glass. And Mira explained that the Aeon clock, in opening to her, had shared with her its burden, its memory, and that soon she would have to follow the thread of one of those memories, not to change what had happened, but to see it, to understand its truth, and perhaps to give it peace. And so Elia chose, guided not by reason, but by a tug in her chest, the image of the boy with the sundial. And at once the archive shifted. the chamber folding around her like the pages of a turning book, and she found herself in a sun-drenched field where shadows stretched long across ancient stone, and a barefoot boy with dark curls was lining up flat rocks in a perfect curve, his face set with quiet concentration. And nearby, an older man watched, not speaking, only occasionally nodding, and Elia knew, somehow, that she could be seen only by the memory itself, not by the people within it, unless the memory wanted her to be seen, and this one did, for the boy paused, looked directly at her, and smiled with such knowing that her breath caught in her chest, and he said, "I wondered when you'd come," and gestured for her to sit. And Elia did, unsure whether she was in the past, or a dream, or something else entirely, and the boy told her his name was Calum, that he had been building the sundial for his village but no one had asked him to, that he had simply felt that time was falling out of place and needed anchoring, and when Elia asked how he knew, he shrugged and said, "The sun doesn't feel the same anymore." And Elia, understanding more than she could explain, helped him arrange the final stones, and as they did, the sundial glowed faintly, and the field shimmered like heat haze, and Calum looked at her with solemn eyes and said, "Someone tried to stop time here once, to hold it still, and it left a bruise." And Elia saw then, briefly, a flicker of an old machine buried beneath the earth, rusted and humming faintly, and she knew this was what she was meant to witness, to carry back to the archive, a record of something forgotten but never gone. And as the sun passed the highest point in the sky, the world around her blurred again, the light bending and folding, and she was back in the archive, the orb now glowing with new warmth, and Mira nodded silently, touching the orb with her fingertips, and sealing the memory inside with a faint chime, and Elia felt older, not in years, but in understanding, as though part of her now spoke in the language of clocks and echoes, and she knew this was only the first of many journeys, each one a step along an invisible path. And though the Aeon clock waited patiently for her return, Elia felt no rush. For time, she was beginning to learn, was not a line or a trap, but a sea, vast, gentle, and full of voices, and she was its listener, its witness, and maybe, one day, its keeper. Time in the liminal archive did not pass in hours or days, but in echoes, and Elia, now wearing the brass hourglass pendant close to her heart, wandered its endless corridors as one might drift through a dream, never quite certain how far she had gone or how long she had been away. And yet she never felt lost, for the clocks lining the walls, some tall as towers, others small as beads, seemed to watch over her like silent sentinels, ticking not just for the present moment, but for all that had ever been and all that still might be. Mira walked beside her sometimes and vanished at others, always returning when needed, like a page that turns itself at the perfect moment. And it was she who led Elia to the Chamber of Forgotten Threads, a quiet room where the ticking grew slow and solemn, and glass domes sat upon marble pedestals, each housing a single floating thread of light, delicate and trembling, each one a timeline that had come unstitched, frayed by sorrow or silence. And Mira explained that when certain moments in history were too painful to be remembered, the world let them go, but not entirely, for memory, like water, always finds a way back, and it was in these threads that such memories waited, soft and aching, for someone gentle enough to hear them. Elia stepped forward and the threads shifted, as if recognizing her presence, and one in particular began to glow warmer, pulsing like a heartbeat, and without needing to ask permission, she placed her fingertips upon the glass, and the room around her melted away. She found herself standing on the edge of a crumbling village, dusk falling fast over blackened rooftops, and in the square stood a single child, a girl with soot-smudged cheeks and a wooden music box clutched tightly in her hands, turning its tiny key over and over, though no sound came from it. And Elia felt the weight of this moment. It was the day after something had been lost, a fire perhaps, or a war, and though the memory was blurred, The emotion was not. The child looked up and saw Elia without surprise, as though she'd been waiting, and said, "It doesn't work anymore," holding out the box, and Elia took it gently, examined the cracked gear inside, and sat with the child on a step worn smooth by time, quietly repairing the mechanism with the smallest turn of her finger, and when she returned it, the box played. Not a cheerful tune, but a lullaby, low and slow, like the wind through pine trees, and the child's eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but relief. And she whispered, "Thank you for remembering," before the memory dissolved into golden mist, and Elia was back in the archive, now holding a newly restored thread in her hands, which Mira wove gently into a tapestry that shimmered faintly as if exhaling. And Elia asked what would happen now, and Mira said simply, "That moment will be remembered, quietly, by the world." And that night, as Elia lay beneath the glass ceiling of the archive's upper observatory, watching constellations drift, like lanterns across the sky, she began to wonder about Horatius Thorn, who he had been before the Aeon had chosen him, what memories he had carried, what sorrows he had tended, and as the clocks ticked softly in the darkness, she felt a pull, not from a thread, but from the Aeon clock itself, which waited patiently beneath the archive in its own chamber, humming with quiet urgency, and when she descended the spiral stairs, she found a new note waiting in the compartment where the first had once been, written in Horatius's familiar script. "Elia, there is one memory I never dared visit, but perhaps you are braver than I was. The Aeon will know the way." And though her hands trembled as she touched the dial, she did not hesitate, for this was why she had been chosen, not just to listen, but to witness what even time itself had whispered about in hushed tones. The clock shuddered softly, and the air filled with the scent of old paper and falling snow, and the chamber grew dim, not with darkness, but with the thick quiet of a memory deeply buried, and Elia stepped forward into it, the ticking of the Aeon slowing as she passed through, like a breath held before a story too important to forget is finally told. The memory that the Aeon clock had guarded so closely, the one Horatius Thorn had never dared to visit, unfolded around Elia with a hush so deep it seemed to silence even her own thoughts, and for a moment she stood within nothing. No floor, no sky, no walls, only a twilight emptiness that stretched in all directions like a held breath, until, slowly, the world began to assemble itself out of shadow and light, forming into a long-forgotten workshop not unlike the clockmaker's shop back in the village, but older, colder, and broken in ways the eye could barely comprehend, as if it had been abandoned for centuries and only now remembered it once existed. Broken clocks lined the walls, their faces frozen at different times. Some cracked down the middle like they had tried to hold back something too heavy, and in the center of the room sat a small boy with his back to her, hunched over a scattered collection of gears and hands, trying desperately to piece together something delicate and complicated with fingers too small and shaking from the cold, and Elia knew at once who he was. Horatius, long before he was ever a master of anything, and the air around the memory felt thick with grief, a sorrow not born from tragedy alone, but from loneliness too deep for words, the kind of loneliness that makes time feel like a weight instead of a gift. The boy was trying to fix a clock that had belonged to someone he had lost, his mother, perhaps, or a sister. Elia could feel it in the way he held each gear like it might disappear if he let go, and as he tried again and again to make the pieces fit, he whispered apologies to no one, to everyone, as if failure itself might undo the memory of someone he could no longer see clearly. And though he could not see her, Elia stepped closer, kneeling beside him, and for a long while she said nothing, only placed her hands gently near his, not touching the parts but simply letting him know he wasn't alone. And gradually the boy's breathing slowed and his hands stopped trembling, and he looked at her, not in surprise but with a kind of recognition, as though her presence had always been written into this moment, just never allowed to arrive, until now, and he whispered, "I didn't want to forget." And Elia whispered back, "You didn't." And something in the room softened, the cold lifting, the gears on the table clicking faintly into place, and the broken clocks on the walls began to tick again, not all at once, but gently, like a melody returning after silence. The boy's form shimmered slightly, the memory easing itself closed but not erased, and Elia felt herself drawn back into the present, the workshop fading like morning mist. And when she opened her eyes again, she was in the Aeon clock's chamber, its dials glowing with a light she had never seen before, warm and golden, like the last sunlight on a quiet field, and standing in the shadows near the far wall was the faintest outline of Horatius himself, not quite a ghost, not quite a memory, but something in between, his eyes kind and calm. And though he said nothing, Elia understood that the memory had been waiting to be seen, not to be changed, but simply to be known, to be honored. And in doing so, something old and heavy had lifted not just from the archive, but from time itself. Later, as she returned to her room beneath the turning stars of the archive's great dome, she found the brass pendant around her neck glowing softly with a new mark, an etched spiral that hadn't been there before. And Mira told her this was the sign of the witness, one who had looked into the deepest part of time and returned not broken but brighter, and that few were given such trust by the Aeon clock. But Elia didn't feel proud. She felt quiet, like a candle newly lit in a vast hall, and as she curled into the warmth of her blanket, listening to the faint ticking that echoed through the archive, she understood that her journey had only just begun. That time was not something to master or mend, but something to hold gently, like an old music box still playing the song of everything that had ever been. The archive had grown quieter in the days that followed, as if it too were resting, breathing more slowly, its clocks ticking in a more peaceful rhythm, and Elia, now known among its secret halls as the Witness, moved through its corridors not as a visitor, but as someone it had accepted, someone it had waited for. And though Mira continued to guide her with quiet smiles and riddles spoken like lullabies, there came a moment when the archive's great hall of doors, the room shaped like a wheel, where each door led to a different place and time, opened not for another journey, but for something else, something final and still, the return. It was not an obligation, but a choice, Mira said, as she handed Elia a folded slip of parchment bearing the simple words, "When it is time to go, leave gently, and time will remember you." And Elia knew, in the deep way one knows the coming of sleep or the turning of seasons, that her time as a traveler was ending, not because the journey had grown cold, but because the world she had left, the quiet village, the crooked little shop, the ticking Aeon clock, was waiting. And so, with a slow breath and a heart full of every thread she had seen, every silence she had mended, every sorrow she had gently witnessed, she stepped through the doorway that led not backward, but inward, and the archive faded like a dream that doesn't vanish, but becomes part of you. And she was once more in the village, though it looked different now, not changed, but clearer, brighter in the way familiar things become when they're seen with new eyes, and the clockmaker's shop, which had stood for so long in stillness, now greeted her with a golden tick that echoed from within the Aeon clock, its hands moving gracefully once more, and the shop, left untouched for ages, now bloomed with quiet life, tiny motes of dust dancing in sunlight, wood creaking softly with each breath of wind, and the great Aeon clock opening one final time to reveal not a letter, not a map, but a mirror, polished and small, and in its reflection Elia saw herself not as she had been, but as she truly was, a keeper of memory, a stitcher of time, and for a moment she saw Horatius Thorn standing behind her, not as a ghost, but as a quiet blessing, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, and then he was gone, and the mirror dimmed, and the Aeon clock gave one last chime, deep and warm and full of 1,000 stories, and went still. Elia did not wind it again, for it no longer needed winding. Not now that it had passed its secret on. Not now that time had found its listener. And so she opened the front door of the little shop each morning, not to sell clocks, but to tell stories. And the villagers came quietly, one by one, to sit by the fire and listen to a girl who had once vanished into time and returned carrying its music. And at night she would look up at the stars through the dusty round window, knowing the archive still turned somewhere far above or far within, and that maybe, one day, someone else would hear the call of the Aeon clock and follow its ticking. Into wonder. But for now, the secret was safe. The circle was complete, and time, at last, was at peace.